Welcome to Episode 10, Shrink Assessment Scope Using Proven Scoping Strategies. Today we focus on ethical scope reduction that lowers real risk while preserving the integrity of validation under the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard, PCI DSS, so your program becomes easier to defend and easier to run. The guiding idea is simple and calm. Move clear text card data out of places it does not need to be, narrow the number of paths that can reach the remaining sensitive systems, and raise the evidence bar on the few people and components that still matter. When you do this with discipline, scope gets smaller because the attack surface gets smaller, not because words were rearranged on a diagram. A leaner scope is a byproduct of better design and stark accountability. It leads to fewer samples, cleaner audits, and a control set that matches how business actually operates rather than how it once worked. That is why this topic matters for the exam and for your daily practice. Ethical reduction is not a loophole, it is precision. Start with the promise you will keep for the rest of this episode. Any scope reduction we pursue must lower risk, maintain compliance integrity, and create better evidence, not just fewer boxes on paper. That means you always tie a scope change to one of three outcomes you can explain aloud without jargon. First, you have removed clear text card data from a system so it no longer stores, processes, or transmits it. Second, you have broken a network path so a system can no longer influence the cardholder data environment unless it passes through a hardened, logged gate. Third, you have transferred a control objective to a validated provider while retaining visibility and routine proof that the objective continues to be met. These outcomes are testable, which is why they survive in assessors' questions. If a proposed reduction does not achieve one of them, you have likely drawn a softer boundary rather than a safer one. Ethical reduction is honest about who holds the keys and where the evidence lives. That honesty is what keeps scope decisions from turning into arguments every renewal season. One of the fastest ways to shrink scope is to stop storing the primary account number, which we will state once as the primary account number, PAN, and then either not keep it at all or render it unreadable where business insists on retention. Truncation cuts the number so reconstruction is infeasible within that dataset and allows you to retain reference utility for customer service or reconciliation without creating a secret stash of full numbers. Tokenization removes the original and replaces it with a surrogate that has no exploitable value outside a tightly controlled vault, which pulls entire application tiers out of the clear text blast radius when designed well. Hashing demands care. Simple hashes are weak because the input space is small, but keyed or salted schemes can contribute when paired with strict custody of the secret and reinforced by rate limiting and monitoring. Encryption at rest remains the standard when you must store full PAN, but encryption only counts when key management is disciplined and duties are segregated. The examiner's safe answer ties each choice to an artifact: schema showing truncation, tokenization design and vault controls, key custody records, and samples that prove masking on screen without full values lurking underneath. Shrinking web exposure starts where many risks begin, the capture form. Replacing custom collection with provider-hosted fields, iframes, or full redirects moves sensitive entry to a service built for that moment and removes merchant code from the path where card data first appears. Hosted fields embed secure inputs into the page while leaving your brand experience intact, and iframes isolate the payment field in a separate origin that your scripts cannot accidentally read when integrity controls are in place. Redirects move customers to the provider entirely for entry, reducing your obligations further while increasing the importance of link integrity and page protection on your side. Each choice still leaves you with duties that keep scope honest, such as script integrity checks, change governance on the container page, and evidence that the provider remains validated. But done well, a hosted or redirected model removes an entire class of findings from your web stack and turns certain controls into provider responsibilities with portable proof. For a reviewer, the difference is striking. Fewer systems that ever touch clear text, fewer places where a configuration slip becomes a breach, and clearer lines for who owes which artifact. In card-present environments, the most powerful reduction move is to insert point-to-point encryption P2PE as early as possible, ideally at the point of interaction, and keep it intact until a secure endpoint you do not manage. A validated P2PE solution ensures that data is encrypted in the device before it traverses your network, which means the systems in between never see clear text and can be placed outside the cardholder data environment with a justified narrative. This shift does not remove your responsibilities, it changes them. You still need device inventories, chain of custody procedures, adherence to implementation guides, and incident playbooks that prove your staff handle devices correctly and respond quickly when something goes wrong. The payoff is significant. Store networks, back-office servers, and even certain support tools move out of the highest sensitivity zone because they cannot alter or observe clear text traffic. Assessors then focus their depth on device handling, solution listings, and evidence that you followed the provider's guide precisely. Scope decreases because encryption removed exposure, not because someone argued that risks were theoretical. Centralization is another force multiplier for reduction. When you cluster payment functions into a small number of well-hardened systems behind tight perimeters and strong identity controls, you reduce the number of components that require intensive monitoring and frequent sampling. A centralized tokenization service, a single locked-down order management interface for detokenization, and a dedicated, well-scoped integration tier can replace a scattered pattern where every app knows a little too much. Centralization also shapes security operations. Logging, alerting, and response become consistent because they deal with a known set of targets and a known set of risky operations. Governance becomes clearer because ownership is concentrated and approvals are easier to verify. For assessment, this all translates into smaller evidence pulls and sharper stories because the program no longer needs to prove a long tail of edge cases. You have fewer doors, stronger locks, and better cameras, which is what an assessor expects to see when a business claims reduced scope with confidence. Once sensitive systems are fenced, you shrink scope more by saying no path rather than no intent. Eliminate unnecessary connectivity from non-CDE zones to CDE resources and to their chump hosts. So the default state is that nothing gets through unless explicitly permitted for a documented purpose. This sounds like a slogan until you tie it to route tables, firewall rules, access control lists, and logging that make the denials visible. A non-CDE web server does not need a route into a database that holds tokens, and a developer workstation should never reach a production jump host without moving through a privileged access workflow and multi-factor checks. Even monitoring platforms, vulnerability scanners, and backup systems must use hardened pathways that cannot be repurposed for lateral movement. For validation, you will show negative tests that prove cannot, positive tests that prove can for the few allowed flows, and identity records that prove who crossed the boundary and when. The fewer paths remain, the easier it is to keep them honest all year. That is how no path becomes less work, not more. Scope shrinks again when you reduce persistent privileges and make high-risk actions noisy. Enforce role-based access so people get only what they need for the job they are performing now, not the job they did last project. Layer this with break glass elevation that requires an approval, a time-boxed window, and a recorded session when someone must enter a sensitive zone. This arrangement does two things at once. It minimizes the number of standing keys that could be misused silently, and it turns the moments of greatest risk into visible, sample-ready events that a reviewer can trace from ticket to login to action. Pair it with just-in-time access for service accounts, so automated processes also carry short-lived credentials. Tie it all to periodic reviews where inactive rights are revoked as a rule and exceptions are documented with a date to expire. A flatter privilege landscape means fewer identities that pull segments into scope, and fewer directories and consoles that must be tested as if they were payment systems. It is quieter and safer at the same time. Another practical reduction move is to retire legacy protocols and insecure services that inflate both exposure and testing effort. If Telnet, unencrypted file transfer, weak ciphers, anonymous binds, or broadcast discovery protocols still exist near sensitive zones, they create the kind of ambient risk that forces assessors to widen their lens and forces your teams to compensate with complex monitoring. Replace them with modern, strongly authenticated, encrypted alternatives that support narrow policy controls, good logging, and clean automation. Doing so lets you collapse firewall rules, simplify baselines, and remove entire classes of checks from your change reviews. The key is to treat deprecation as a project with owners, dates, and acceptance criteria you can say out loud. When a control set demands secure protocols, your evidence should show that a policy exists, controls block the old, exceptions are rare and dated, and monitoring alerts if someone tries to reintroduce the past. Clean networks invite cleaner scopes because fewer oddities require permanent exceptions with messy papers attached.
You can also shrink scope by outsourcing specialized functions to validated providers while keeping oversight and proof where they belong. Anti-fraud analytics, secure software-based entry, vaulting, and managed logging are examples where providers operate control objectives at scale with better depth than most single entities can afford. The safe pattern here is not abdication, it is shared responsibility written clearly. Obtain the provider's attestation of compliance, service description, and change notification procedures. Map which controls they perform to meet the objective and which edges you still own, such as local configuration, identity, or event triage. Then set a cadence for retrieving evidence and a path for incident coordination that includes who speaks to whom and when. This turns outsource into operate in partnership, which is the only form that reduces scope without introducing blind spots. On the exam, pick the answer that says you shift duties and retain verification, not the one that implies a brand name removes your local obligations by magic. Reduction efforts fall apart when stray copies and verbose logs keep pulling innocent systems back into scope, so automate discovery to catch what people miss. Build lightweight crawlers that look for PAN patterns in common storage and file shares. Instrument gateways to flag payloads with certain fields. Configure log frameworks to drop or mask sensitive fields by default rather than trusting every developer to remember exclusions. And scan backups before they join rotation to ensure they do not contain forbidden data. Automate checks and build pipelines so test datasets never include real card numbers and developers cannot turn on debug modes that echo bodies to consoles. The discipline is to move from be careful to cannot. Then prove cannot with reports that show nothing was found and that the scanner itself is alive and sampling the right places. A quiet environment is not one with fewer alarms. It is one where the wrong bytes cannot land on unmanaged shelves. When you have redesigned flows, tightened paths, and tuned identities, validate the result with technical and governance checks that mirror assessment work. Run segmentation tests that prove denial between non-CDE and CDE networks. Then confirm allowed routes carry only what policy intends by reviewing packet captures or flow logs over time rather than in a single heroic moment. Conduct access reviews that show roles are right-sized and that elevation events tie back to tickets with approvals and expiry dates. Where the standard allows flexibility, perform targeted risk analyses with documented inputs and decisions that explain why a chosen frequency or method still achieves the control objective. The point is not to stack paperwork. It is to produce artifacts that a stranger can use to agree that your reduction lowered risk and left controls operating as designed. Results that stand up to a sample are reductions that last. You lock in the win when you document rationale, controls, and evidence in a way an auditor can retrace without a tour guide. Write the story in plain language. What changed, why it changed, who owns the new process, and which artifacts prove it works. Then connect that story to the standard by naming the objectives satisfied and the evidence types that make those objectives visible. Include dates and approvals so outcomes attach to people rather than to slides. This is not bureaucracy. It is a defensive play that saves you hours later because every question reduces to following a path that already exists on paper. The best documentation feels almost boring when read aloud. It says what you did, shows what you kept, and tells the reviewer how to check it. Boring is a compliment when the topic is scope, because it means the boundary is no longer contested every quarter. Environments evolve, which is why scope reduction is never a one-time event. Reassess after major changes, such as a new channel, a shift to a different tokenization platform, a large network refactor, a move into new cloud constructs, or a merger that brings new acceptance patterns. Treat each change as a prompt to rerun your simple scoping verbs: store, process, transmit, manage, monitor. Ask whether new data appears in places you did not intend, whether new paths opened between zones you thought were separate, and whether new roles can now influence the cardholder data environment without passing through your gates. If the answer to any of these is yes, adjust quickly and capture the adjustment in your story with evidence dates that prove you closed gaps rather than discussing them. This recurrent discipline keeps scope where you set it when things were calm and prevents quiet drift from undoing months of careful work. A final move that unites strategy with practice is to make reduction an explicit part of your change review, not a separate charter that only security remembers. When teams propose features or architectures, ask a short set of questions out loud. Will this introduce new clear text? Will it create new paths in the sensitive zones? Will it expand privilege? And can we meet the requirement through a provider or a hardened shared service we already trust? These questions do not block progress, they channel it. They help designers pick hosted fields over homegrown input, choose private endpoints over public exposure, and reuse jump hosts over inventing side doors. Over time, your default design decisions will support smaller scope even before a security review begins. Reduction then becomes a property of how you build, not a rescue project you bolt on. That is how scope stays small after the fanfare ends. To translate all of this into action, pick one candidate this week and trial a 3-step plan that you can say aloud on a walk. First, nominate a reduction target that will change your map, such as removing full PAN from a reporting database or moving web capture into hosted fields. Second, define the gate that proves the change worked, such as a schema change that drops a column and a scanner that confirms no full PAN appears in exports. Or a deployment that replaces a capture form with an iframe and a monitoring rule that rejects scripts which try to touch the field. Third, schedule a validation and a short write-up that names the artifacts and the people so a reviewer could retrace without help. Run the pilot quietly and quickly, then repeat the pattern for the next target. Small wins accumulate into a shape the auditor can recognize and a system your teams can maintain without heroics. We will close with the same calm promise from the start. Ethical scope reduction is precision, not avoidance, and it will pass any fair test because it leaves fewer places to fail and clearer evidence where controls still live. You moved clear text out, installed strong capture where it belongs, encrypted early with P2PE where possible, and centralized sensitive functions behind doors that open rarely and loudly. You removed routes that had no business purpose, turned privilege into a short-lived event, and retired protocols that made every review harder than it needed to be. You kept oversight when you shifted duties to providers, taught tools to refuse forbidden data, and proved your boundaries with tests that a stranger could repeat. Most important, you wrote down the why, the how, and the proof, then checked again when your world changed. Now assign the one scope reduction candidate and the 3-step plan to your next stand-up and read it out loud. A scope you can say is a scope you can defend, and a scope you can defend is the one that stays small. Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit DailyCyber.News.